Today I want to talk about the different plans each of Canada's major parties has for housing going into the upcoming federal election. This video is going to be kind of long and pretty boring, so let's just get right to it. First up, we've got the Liberals, who have already been in power for almost 10 years and have implemented things like the Housing Accelerator Fund, which basically withholds funding from municipalities unless they make their local regulations more housing friendly. Personally, I kind of consider this jurisdictional meddling, where the federal government is trying to use their general ability to tax people as a way to take over stuff that's supposed to be provincial jurisdiction, but it's up to you whether you think the ends justify the means. In terms of new policy, the main part of the Liberal plan for the election is to create a new government agency called Build Canada Homes, which seems to be something very similar to the previous mandate of the CMHC. They aim to provide $25 billion in financing for public-private partnerships for new home construction. Within this plan, they want to leverage newer technologies like mass timber construction and modular housing to speed up timeframes and reduce costs. They also want to reintroduce tax incentives for new rental housing construction, similar to what we did in the 1970s to address low vacancy rates. Another significant promise is cutting municipal development charges in half. It's not exactly clear how they'll do this, but I saw this proposed by the Ontario Liberals in their recent election, and their idea was basically for the higher level of government to reimburse municipalities for their lost revenue. It's not a terrible idea because development charges are a big hurdle for new housing, but in a way, it also rewards municipalities like Toronto that made themselves overly reliant on development charges as a source of revenue, while punishing cities who took a more sustainable approach. Overall, I think it's a good plan in principle, but I don't really have much faith in the Liberals to execute it, and I think the timeline is pretty unrealistic. They already promised an affordable housing plan back in 2015, which they didn't deliver on. The public-private partnership model is very similar to what they originally proposed with the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which sat for years getting almost nothing accomplished, until a couple of years ago when a new CEO named Aaron Corey came in and refocused the entire organization on accomplishing smaller, more achievable projects that addressed immediate needs in communities. In a lot of ways, getting the right people into these bureaucratic management roles is more important than choosing elected officials. We need people who can actually get stuff done, not just ideas that sound good up front. So, like I said, I like this plan in principle, but we've also seen the current Liberal administration make a lot of big promises over the past decade, but not that much has actually materialized. At a certain point, even if we like the policy proposals, we need to stop rewarding failure. Next, we've got the Conservatives. A lot of their proposed housing policy is contained in something called the Building Homes Not Bureaucracy Act, which was pitched back in 2023. I went over this in a video I made a year ago, but it's worth going over it again for the election. The first couple of points in their plan are almost identical to the Housing Accelerator Fund, which is kind of funny given how much Poilievre has attacked the plan over the past few years, but whatever. Basically, they want municipalities to increase the pace of home building by 15% every year or have federal funding withheld. It's a bit more of a hands-off approach because they're not pushing for specific policies, but the targets are a bit ridiculous because 15% per year means the rate of construction will be doubling every 5 years. The other problem with this plan is that the baseline is whatever the municipality was producing already. So you'd be punishing places like Edmonton that worked hard to stay ahead of the issue, while rewarding places like Toronto that have placed a lot of restrictions on new housing construction. Next, they mention withholding federal funding for transit projects unless the areas around the project are zoned for high-density housing. This is a good idea, but it's kind of ruined by the last half of the proposal, which is that funding won't be provided until the homes are built and occupied. This means that municipalities wouldn't be able to get funding for transit projects until years after the projects are already built, which would probably make a lot of these projects non-viable because you still need actual cash flow to build things like train lines. In a sense, they're just saying that they're going to shut down all transit funding for a decade. They also say they'll impose a rule against NIMBYism for cities. NIMBY stands for Not in My Backyard and refers to people who refuse all kinds of new housing developments. It's not very clear how they'd actually monitor and enforce this other than by creating a hotline for people to call if they think their city is getting a little too NIMBY. This also strikes me as something they'll probably backpedal on after the election because the Conservative voting base and the NIMBY contingent at public hearings tends to have a lot of overlap. They also want to sell off federal land and buildings that they think could be turned into housing. I'm not a huge fan of this plan because it basically means we're permanently giving up an important asset, which is public land, and selling it off to the private sector, then hoping that they willingly turn it into affordable housing. It kind of seems like we're getting short-term gain for long-term pain. There's a couple of other things in here, like putting pressure on the CMHC to get the average approval time for housing projects down to 60 days. I think that's pretty doable, even if it means adding something like a conditional approval, where developers would get a list of specific conditions that they would need to meet in order to get final approval. They also want to remove the GST on new homes under $1.3 million, as well as rental properties with rents below the average market value. Much like the Liberals, the Conservatives have also said that they're going to cut municipal development charges by reimbursing municipalities for 50% of any development charge cut. Overall, the plan from the Conservatives basically seems to be handing the issue off to municipalities and having them deal with it, which kind of makes sense, but it also doesn't really get the federal government involved as part of the solution. They're doing a lot to order municipalities to solve the problem, but not much to support them, if that makes sense. Next up, we've got the NDP. Their plan has some similarities to the first two plans, in that they say they'll build 3 million homes by 2030 by replacing the Housing Accelerator Fund with something that's pretty much exactly like the Housing Accelerator Fund, withholding federal funding unless municipalities loosen regulations around housing construction. This is broken down into the Canadian Homes Transfer and the Communities First Fund, where they touch on a lot of the same themes as the two larger parties, including transit-oriented development, speeding up approvals, and cutting development charges in half. They also mentioned training 100,000 skilled workers for new home construction. The NDP is also the only party that's proposing a national rent control scheme. I'm not going to go through every bullet point individually, but overall the plan seems a little light on the details and mainly focuses on outcomes they'd like to achieve, but not so much on how they're actually going to achieve them. Next, we have the Bloc Quebecois, and as you might expect, the plan is very Quebec-centric. They want any federal housing funds to be handed over unconditionally to be used as Quebec sees fit. Using these transfers, they want to increase the proportion of non-market affordable housing to 20% and provide funding for renovations of those units as they age. They also want to tighten the rules around house flipping, have federal land and buildings sold off to small organizations at below market value, and push for federal funding for student housing. They also want the CMHC to provide mortgage insurance for smaller seniors' residences of less than 50 units in areas outside the major cities, and invest in the renovation of existing seniors' residences so that seniors can stay in their community. They also say they support the removal of GST on new homes for first-time buyers, but they're also proposing to remove GST on services for first-time buyers like home inspectors and notaries. Finally, they mention advocating for more federal funding to fight homelessness. Overall, the plan is really focused on the Quebec market, but even more so on insisting that the federal government let Quebec take the money and run the programs themselves, which is a pretty common theme in BQ policy. The Green Party, much like the NDP, focuses a lot on outcomes they'd like rather than a lot of detail about how they'd actually implement it. They say they want to get the government back in the business of building housing, redefine affordable housing to be geared towards people's incomes, and make housing more available to individuals and less available to corporations. They've got a few specific points around eliminating corporate tax advantages, stopping money laundering, and preventing corporations from buying up single-family homes, but one interesting policy idea they have is using covenants to ensure that housing built with public money stays affordable forever. Covenants are basically a contract that's attached to the land title of the actual property, and they're pretty hard to remove, so if you have a covenant saying that the housing needs to stay affordable, it would be a pretty strong requirement. The problem to me is, if they're trying to do this as some kind of public-private partnership, I'm not sure how many people would actually agree to have that kind of covenant attached to the property. Depending on exactly how it's worded, it has the potential in the long term to make that property into a toxic asset that's unprofitable to own and difficult to sell, so it's potentially messier than having the government just build public housing outright. Overall, I was a little disappointed in how vague this housing platform was, because the Greens actually have quite a few interesting policy ideas that I think are worth bringing into the public discussion, and a lot of them aren't what you'd probably expect. They've got proposals for the largest income tax cut of any party, as well as the creation of a civil defense corps, which no other party is even talking about. Obviously, they don't have a chance of forming government anytime soon, but I think it's worth checking out what they have to say. Finally, we have the PPC, aka the Pink Pony Club. The first point in their plan is a moratorium on immigration, although interestingly, they only talk about permanent residents, even though the majority of the rapid increase we saw in the last couple of years was non-permanent residents. Next, they say they want to decrease the Bank of Canada's inflation target from 2% to 0%. It's not exactly clear how this would help affordability, because presumably it would have the same impact on wages. But it would probably push interest rates higher, which would put downward pressure on housing prices. There's some issues with targeting zero inflation that I've talked about before, but it's not really relevant to this video. After that, there's a section titled Respect Local Planning, which is basically a paragraph with some pro-NIMBY language suggesting that they won't do anything to influence municipal policy. Which, honestly, to me is fair enough, because municipalities are supposed to be provincial jurisdiction, not federal. Next, they say they want to dismantle the CMHC, which just encourages people to spend more on housing than they can afford, while putting all the risk on taxpayers. To an extent, I actually agree with this in terms of how the government has been using CMHC mortgage insurance and the Canada Mortgage Bond program to inject liquidity into the mortgage lending market. On the other hand, the CMHC does a lot of other stuff too in terms of market research, analysis, reporting, and administering some other housing-related programs. It seems like their beef is mostly with the mortgage insurance stuff, but they're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater here. Finally, they say they want to restrict foreign home buyers and stop money laundering in the land and housing markets. The problem with this is that there's already restrictions on foreign buyers and investment, so without any details on what they do differently, this is more just stating a problem than offering a solution. Overall, in my opinion, not a particularly strong long-term plan on housing, but it probably does appeal to their base. So, bringing this all together, I don't think any of these plans will actually solve our housing affordability crisis. The parties have made a lot of promises, but really there's only a couple of things the federal government can actually do on housing. Build public housing directly, or subsidize the construction of housing. The big jurisdictional issue here is that municipalities have the most control over how housing gets built, and they're under the control of provinces, not the federal government. But this is a really important aspect of our housing issues, and it's why I say that we need all the levels of government pulling in the same direction. NIMBYism is a really powerful force in municipal politics, and the gears of government grind really slowly, so the NIMBY lobby can usually outlast housing advocates, and there's hurdle after hurdle that has to be passed to actually get housing built. As an example, a couple of years ago I was making videos following the story of Calgary and their affordable housing plan. They passed the overall housing plan after a marathon public hearing, then they passed citywide rezoning, which is a very controversial issue, after an even longer hearing. However, when the next stage came and they had to update local area plans to be consistent with the new housing strategy, that's when the vote failed. With less public attention on what was going on, the NIMBY lobby once again became the loudest voices in the room, and they were able to block new housing development. So I think there's a discussion to be had about municipal policies and what the extent of public hearings should be. If you care about politics in terms of getting better policies put in place, municipal elections are a great place to get involved because your individual voice matters more and you're getting involved with something happening right in your own community. The next issue is the timelines being proposed are totally unrealistic. Most parties are promising to fix this by 2030 or basically one electoral cycle. The problem is, as I said before, a lot of this is dependent on municipalities, and a lot of the delays and permitting issues happen at the municipal level, which adds a lot of extra time and extra cost to getting housing built. As an example, Sean Hildebrand of Urbanation has been mentioning an interesting stat lately, which is that the average time from application to completion for a new purpose-built rental building in Toronto is 100 months, which is almost 8.5 years. So even if we get a new project started the day after the election, we're not going to see the actual results until well after 2030. So personally, I think all the parties are being a little dishonest with us when they say they're going to get millions of homes built in the next few years. It took us a long time to get ourselves into this mess, and it's going to take a long time to get out of it. We're also going to need to reduce barriers to home building at all levels of government, not just federal. It's going to be a long road, and whatever solutions we want to go with, we're going to have to actually stick with them for the long haul, not just start and stop them with every election cycle. Something else I've seen people criticizing these plans for frequently is that they have a lot of focus on rental housing and not so much on building new homes for people to buy. I'll preface this section by saying that several months ago, I started a new job as a content manager for Rentals.ca, which is a rental listing service, so take that for what you will. If you want to disregard this section because of it, fine, but I'll also say that these are opinions that I had for years before I even started making videos, and they're based on data and personal experience, but I don't want to create the impression that I'm hiding my motivations from you. In my opinion, a focus on purpose-built rental housing is good, whether it's coming from the public or private sector. A healthy, well-functioning rental market is the foundation of a healthy housing market because it's the baseline of what people can afford even if they're just starting out. When I was younger, I had a choice of different options of where to rent, and I was able to choose cheaper, less luxurious places to save money, which eventually allowed me to purchase a home. However, when we've got a super tight rental market with vacancy rates at or below 1%, people don't really have that same choice that I did. So I think we need more supply in the rental market, but for a long time, developers found more profit and less risk by building condos, which were then bought up and rented out by small-time investors, so one building might have 100 different landlords in it. This is obviously inefficient, but it was the most profitable option for developers. If we give tax breaks and financing to make purpose-built rentals more attractive as an investment, we'll get more of what we actually need. There is a really strong cultural preference for owning over renting, but personally, I think this attitude of ownership being better at any cost is something that distorts the market. We're really just repeating the same mistake that the US made in the years leading up to 2008. They saw that homeowners tended to be more financially stable, have more savings, and have a higher net worth, so they naturally assumed that the best solution is to get more people into homeownership by any means necessary. I think that this is a complete mix-up of cause and effect, kind of like if you said, volleyball players are very tall on average, so if you're short and you want to get taller, play volleyball. As a result, they tried to promote homeownership by giving people easy access to huge amounts of debt, and as a result, they crashed the global economy and drove us into a recession that lasted from 2008 until, hopefully, only a few more years now. In reality, it's financial stability and savings that allow people to become homeowners, so if you want to increase the homeownership rate, you have to give people good job opportunities and a stable, reasonably affordable housing market. If you just give people cheap mortgages, you're just going to create a debt and housing bubble. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about immigration, because people in the comments get upset if I don't bring this up in every single video. Yes, the way we've been handling immigration is a problem that has drastically impacted the housing market, mainly by decreasing vacancy rates in the rental market. But no, just reducing immigration won't magically solve all of our housing woes. My position for a long time now has been that housing price inflation has mostly been driven by cheap debt, not immigration. In fact, the housing price peak in March of 2022 actually happened before the massive population spike that we saw in the following couple of years. What I'd like people to understand is that in practical terms, immigration policy is not driven by party ideology, it's driven by public perception. For the past 20 years, under both the Conservatives and the Liberals, the mainstream idea being pushed by both parties was that we needed more immigration to grow the economy. Both parties have always been completely aligned on immigration targets. But once the middle class finally saw rapid immigration affecting them, both parties switched their messaging on immigration on the same day. I don't think this is just a matter of the Conservatives not being allowed to speak against immigration either. The Harper government massively expanded the TFW program, they set a target to double the size of the international student program, and they loosened rules around work hours for student visas. In 2014, when Jason Kenney said he was going to reduce the size of the TFW program, what he actually did was spin off part of it into the International Mobility Program, which allowed companies to hire foreign workers without even needing a labor market impact assessment, or LMIA. That program quickly exploded in size and actually accounts for a lot of the temporary residents we see today. Even during the recent immigration spike, when the Liberals were claiming a labor shortage and completely removed the cap on student visa work hours, basically turning the foreign student program into a backdoor work visa, the Conservative Shadow Minister for Immigration, who was appointed by Pierre Poilievre, said they would have acted more quickly to relax the rules on student visas. And look, none of this is to say that this is all the Conservatives' fault or that the Liberals haven't done a terrible job also. I'm just pointing out that the parties are not nearly as different on this issue as they like to pretend. As a result of this, there were a lot of recent reforms made to non-permanent resident programs, like capping student visas, and more importantly, removing the 50 points added to the immigration score for having a job with an LMIA. That really pulls the rug out from underneath a lot of these immigration consultant schemes for temporary foreign workers, because now what they're selling has a lot less value. These changes obviously happened way later than they should have, but they have been implemented and they're already having an effect. Last quarter was the first time in quite a while that we've seen a net outflow of non-permanent residents, and that's probably going to accelerate over the next year or two as these temporary visa programs have lost a lot of their value. This trend is already happening, but obviously whoever wins the election is going to try to take sole credit for it. That kind of wraps up the analysis and criticism of the major party plans, but if there was something I'd like to add to these policy proposals, it would be something to encourage people building their own homes, especially in rural areas. Particularly with remote work these days, people have a lot more ability to live wherever they want, and people building their own homes is just as useful as a developer building homes for them. Overall, I'd like to see that same kind of favorable permitting and financing extended to individuals who are creating new housing, especially for things like homesteaders and small-scale farmers. That would potentially have the added benefit of diversifying and decentralizing our food supply and reducing our reliance on other countries. So, that's all for this video on the housing platforms. If you haven't voted already, go out and do it on Monday, and vote for whoever the hell you want. I'm not endorsing any party or even a specific housing plan, since they're all kind of similar, and there's not really much that the federal government can do to solve this on their own anyway. By all means, go and vote in this federal election, but I'd also encourage you to look up your local municipal politics and see what's going on. I really do think that's the level of government where ordinary people can have the most impact, and it's also where a lot of our core housing issues stem from. If your city makes it hard to build, you get less housing. If it's easy, you get more housing. So let's try to make it easier. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.